Know Thyself is dedicated to the exploration of the most rewarding task an individual can ever embark on, the journey to find oneself. Our intention is to investigate the universal principles that have equipped our species to seek the treasure of all treasures, self-knowledge. With your host, Daniel Powinski and Eduardo Manteca, this is the Know Thyself podcast.
Hello.
Welcome to the Know Thyself podcast. I'm here with Daniel.
Hello.
I'm Eduardo. And here we go, man. It's been some time right now. We've been doing a lot of preparing for these next episodes that are coming up, as you know, as we've been talking about, pretty much a lot. And I think this idea that of us having this open conversation about the topics that are coming up next, the significance of these topics and what they really mean for us and what we provide to our audience, are not just crucial, but I think it's time that we have these conversations openly, between you and I, for our audience to hear, and how we prepare and how we really, work in these themes that apply not only to our own lives, but hopefully for the lives of others that are trying to, move ahead in this life. And so Daniel had this great idea where, we decided that we would, again, record this conversation. These conversations we always have before we hit record, and, the readiness that we have to sort of engage in with one another before we go on to the next topic, or how we relate it to the topic from the week before. And, for next week, we will have this topic, especially on Greek mythology. But I'm excited to talk just to you today, man, about, all these relatable subjects and how they all intertwine, and what they'll be covering for the next few episodes. So, yeah, man.
Yeah. No, I love that introduction, and I love that we're going to kind of discuss things that are in the near future, but also always kind of looking back to the past.
Yeah.
And this was something that was quickly brought up on a patron video this week. But this forever harvest of principles, esoteric understanding, and symbolism. These aren't just, we always talk about like going back to these subjects, and like what we're going to do tomorrow and next week, when we're going to talk about the mythology stories that
right.
That are going to kind of uncover, and how they're going to kind of help open up the zodiac and give us this bigger idea. But these forever harvesting of these principles, we really have to think of the occult almost like wheat, and it almost always is growing, and we're always watering it as we continue down this path. Mm-hmm. And so it's very important for us to go back to all of the early principles, all the stories, everything that we've studied. You have to go back, because more has grown there, because you've nourished it ever since you've chosen to really live in this life of the observer, really observing the spiritual understanding, and really that connection to that higher self, right?
For sure.
And so this process of always going back and yielding the harvest of the work that we do, the further understanding, and then the new perspective you have. And that's what's so deep about these, is because they're forever unfolding. You only get the message that you're supposed to get. Mm-hmm. It's the same thing with books. Especially now, I've been going back to certain books that were really powerful to me. And of course, those passages I highlighted 5-6 years ago in my study still rock my world, right? Just like amazing. But now all of a sudden, the ones that don't have highlights, all of a sudden, wow, now I see this. I can see the bigger picture. At that time, the lesson was focused on these lines, and I completely foregone these, the lines that came afterwards. But after you go back and you connect to it, it's like this harvest. It's this forever coming of information. And not only is occult text like that, but these principles, and definitely symbols. And that's what we're going to approach in mythology, is this understanding of symbols and the foreverness and the constant unfoldment. And it's as we unfold ourselves that we get a better understanding. And through that, a better incorporation because that's the final step. It's really incorporating these universal archetypes within us and connecting our soul to even the far grander plan, above the personal, to the collective, to that approaching that Christ consciousness, which is those later steps in alchemy, that 6th and that 7th step.
Yeah, no, I love what you're saying in regards to the incorporation, because I mean, that's exactly what happened to me just studying. And we don't want to spoil what we're doing for next week. I don't want to say the exact topic, but in Greek mythology, you start to see all the correlations between, just the 7 even stages of alchemy. You start to see even just one of the 7 through alchemy. You'll start to relate what the transmutation of the individual in the story in Greek mythology is actually going through, what the occurrence of the in the story is actually has as an unfolded approach of this sort of, like, even we talked about this before with the hero's journey, but you sort of see these deeper layers, and it just, what it really does for me is it causes this, aside from like right now speaking in sort of a broken way, is that I have to sort of check myself and say less and sort of take it all in and see what the meaning really is behind everything. Because you read things so straightforward, and then you realize, oh, okay, well, I see what they're putting down. It's like it's that easy to see what they're putting down. But then you read it again, and you're like, oh my gosh, how did I not see that before? And it takes me like a lot longer now, I would say, than it did before, to sort of digest, absorb, and then to come on here and be able to talk. And so, again, in the last, few days of studying some of these, ancient stories, I have to sort of slow down and rather than just running through pages, I'm like, okay, I'm reading just like 2 pages back and back again. I'm like, oh my gosh, okay, there it is, really finding the way to let it resonate like it didn't before. And I think that's, to me, one of the greatest rewards of having an understanding like this, but also there's a discipline aspect to it where you have to say, okay, like, it's okay that you're not getting past 8 pages as quickly as you used to, and you're probably not supposed to. So I like what you're saying about, even what you've highlighted before, and it still resonates with you, but now there's these other in-betweens that kind of come up to you. And I don't know, I think that's an awesome, it's comforting for me to hear you say that, because, I do feel alone in it sometimes, I go on and on for days when I'm not seeing friends or family, or even, of course, Daniel, when we'll check up on with one another about a topic we're talking about. But I'm still just a person trying to make sense of a lot of interpretations of where we are in life, and those who came before us who are trying to leave a piece of themselves to guide us through maybe something that they didn't realize until the end of the road for them in their physical realm. And I'm still a young person trying to put these pieces together and be real about, where I'm at emotionally, where I'm at mentally. And yeah, I mean, does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely, man. And it's interesting because when we do start approaching these mythology, we're seeing the weight of gold of learning the alchemical language, which is that universal language. So now we're able to see these stories. We're able to read the Bible. It's all through this deeper perspective. Mm-hmm. And that's what we're kind of approaching as we're even looking to, how do we maneuver this through our lives? How do we incorporate this? It's this approaching, but it's this quickening that as you align yourself, there's immediate feedback given from universal consciousness, where you feel that feedback that pulls you back in, and a little goes a long way with the universal life force, because it is all, it's the lowest common denominator, right? And so we feel that feedback, but it's just so interesting because, again, in mythology, everything, it's all going to get connected, and everything's so It's all so much more beautiful when it's connected. And that's actually how the ancients kind of looked at that aspect of what you would consider universal life force and what you would consider the deity of like the devil or that low base consciousness.
Right.
And the aspect of that wholeness is seeing all the parts come together. You know, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts,
Right.
which is the opposite of what Satanism would be, which kind of separates everything up into its component, right? And we can kind of see which one kind of it plays its cycle in the lives that we kind of leave. But this aspect of the whole and this complete and this holistic understanding, what this alchemical language brings us to, it, you know, we're not just talking about stories, but you're already talking about numbers with like 7, you know, and you think about the number 7 and you think about it even with your life. And we kind of think about like the story of Saturn Returns, which is told all the way through mythology.
Yes.
Right. And it's like that 28-year mark, you know, and we spoke about this before and it's great. I was reading astrological essay by Manly P. Hall, and it was actually looking at the astrological understanding of infant mortality through the astrological lens. So very in-depth study. And that's, again, you know, one of the things when we study the esoteric and the occult, there is difficult subjects. It's not all beauty. And we definitely know this, but there's really no such thing as negative knowledge. Knowledge is only negative if we use it to create a negative end, right? And that's the only aspect. All knowledge is something that we need to probably understand, you know, the incorporation. And so even with stories like this, you're kind of going through this, but he speaks about these 7-year cycles that work within us and the elements of how they fall. And if you think about it, that first 7-year cycle represents Earth. And you kind of think about like your early life and you're just getting to know your body, right? We talk about it on the natal chart readings. Like when you meet your ascendant for the first time, which is like your first original relationship with life, that was like the first time you wiggled your fingers and like your mother or your caretaker didn't wiggle theirs. And you're like, oh my gosh, I'm my own conscious individual. You know, like that's the ultimate hero's dose right there, right? And you went through that and you had an original lens at life and that's what you kind of look like. But this Earth is this very early formation and it's the first 7 years. So again, we have the alchemical process. And then when we're going through mythology, there's a certain set of stories about this first 7 years. And now it's not always spoken through a child's lens, but it's usually about the early start of a journey, early maturity of somebody. It's the beginning, right? And that's what we kind of told. And this always represented Earth. Yeah. Right? That 7-year cycle. And we can totally get it, right? Understanding your body, understanding the limits, understanding what are the social norms.
Right.
You know, just again, Saturn. So Saturn's already kind of shown up, which is interesting because this is kind of your first connection with Saturn is in the beginning of this 0, right? Because he's actually going to be the individual that meets you at the end of this cycle as well. And so we have this Earth aspect, we have this expansion, and then the second 7 years is water. And isn't that so interesting how we have like the development of the emotions, right? And now we can also think about all these aspects of mythology that have to do with water stories. Right. It's going to be about this kind of period, right? And so that's this aspect in this 7-year cycle. So now this is from 7 to 14, and we have this aspect of water. And then it goes from 14 to 21, we have that aspect of fire. And of course, we kind of see that the 17, 18, the 21-year-old kind of catching you right at the end of that spark and that whole aspect. And then it lends with air. And we have the idolization, the idea of creating thought, the personality, right? The whole intellectual is kind of formed. And then that's when the whole cycle kind of starts back over. And so we have these 28-year patterns. And at the end of that, we have Saturn comes back around and it checks you. How did you handle the 4 elements? How did you handle these aspects of life, what these represented? And we're going to see this represented so beautifully through stories, through imagery, something that we don't really have the ability to do anymore in this kind of sense. Like we have great writers and there's individuals that can tap into this, but this way to communicate universal natural law is really just this beautiful orchestra that's happening kind of in front of your eyes. And so this mythology is going to just be, I think, a fantastic little jumping point to not only help connect our like Bible studies, but just how everything plays. It's all part of the great work.
Absolutely. No, I really like that you're bringing that up because, the imagery that we can replicate right now, we see beautiful art, throughout history, of course, and in this present moment, we see a lot of, great art that is represented by, unique individuals who are using that talent to express themselves. But it's kind of crazy that we don't use the art as much as we once did in order to communicate or convey an emotional pinpoint in the evolution of our lives through these imagery, through this imagery. Does that make sense? We use words now, and we're thankful to have the words that have come about since like, the 20th century, with psychology, modern psychology coming in and kind of giving you the word that you can utilize to describe the emotional abandonment you might have, or the detachment you might have encountered with an individual in your life, and that's why you may feel this way or think this way. But with symbols and imagery, you can do this very deep connection to something more that I don't even have the words for, that I keep finding within the studies that we do. I love that you bring up Manly P. Hall, but man, there's some stuff that I start to read and I'm like, oh my gosh, it's really hard to wrap my head around what he's saying and what he's trying to convey, but I feel what he's trying to convey. And so, yeah, so I know we kind of did that with when we were breaking down the Bible. We were talking about, what this really actually represents. And in this case, like say, just when we started talking about Noah and his ark, we talked about, what it really embodied, what it really meant as far as what the ark was. And I'm not sure if a lot of the listeners agreed or disagreed with the way we broke that down, but nonetheless, there's many individuals that came before us who can kind of give you, or I should say, enlighten you to have an understanding of what is actually being described here in this story, right? And so I really like that you're saying all this, because that's exactly how I've been feeling lately in the last, I would say, like 6 months, is that I have to go back and I have to sort of take the words and not necessarily take them lightly, but don't try to define them in such a rigid fashion, because then I kind of lose the interpretation that was left there for me to have. Does that make sense?
Right.
And so that's what I feel like I'm slowly, the evolution of my understanding of the esoteric or the occult has become more anchored with these symbols. Mm-hmm. And less with the quotes, even though, I know that we'll go on and quote great philosophers of their time or of the time rather, and say, hey, this resonates with me. Does it resonate with you? But the way that it was done in Greek mythology, or the way it was done even in the biblical series that we were doing with Genesis, just has such a more impact that I hope more individuals can kind of go back to with that kind of, understanding. We talked about Terrence Malick and the way he films, and like he's like the only person I know in modern day with regards to cinema who can do that and give you that deeper meaning,
Right.
But it is getting lost, where people are like, well, I'm seeing the imagery and I've seen movies that are great, but this just didn't resonate with me. And it's like, no, I think your eyes are trying to give you the understanding of the images you're seeing by the way you're perceiving the image from a sort of conditioned state versus like an open mind of, oh, this is what they're really trying to say, that it has a duality here, a deeper meaning going on. And so that's kind of what I keep running into with a lot of the studying that we're doing now, is that I'm sort of like having to take a step back and reassess and relook at what actually was left behind for us to feel inside, rather than just, like I love the way you're talking about the 4 elements in regards to these divided stages in sevens that we go through in life. But you're absolutely right. It's just, how it's interpreted and how, we get checked from the time that we started that journey with Saturn, and then how Saturn comes back to kind of be like, hey, so where are you at right now with all of this? You know what I mean?
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, no, man.
Yeah.
And I love the idea too. And I love how we're really kind of focusing on symbols, because a symbol is an outer and visible form of an inner and spiritual reality.
Okay.
And so that symbol's that outer and visible form of an inner and spiritual reality. And I think when we start to understand that these myths, these are not stories that are happening out in front of us. These stories, it's inner reality making itself present. It's the inner, it's the inner conflict. We are all going through these stories. We all travel through the zodiac. We're going to go through all of the houses. Mm-hmm. We dance at the Last Supper. We break bread with all 12 disciples, right? Through that aspect of the sun in the middle. And so there's this whole uncoming, and there's just a bigger ability to see these really larger housings. And we always talk about housings, and it's that container of the universal energy.
Right.
And what we're going to be able to do with mythology is we're going to get to lower common denominators of these housing at units of energies, the mother feeders to the rest of reality. And everything else is going to be kind of touched by these large essences and deep human desires and aspects of our consciousness that are going to be represented in all of these stories that we've been talking, whether they're, whatever mythology tradition, it's all the same, right? It's all that kind of universal thing. But that's what we're going to be approaching from. And I think that's going to be a really kind of unique way of helping not only further our understanding, but also make it more relatable and see why it's so important to travel those to all aspects of consciousness.
Right.
Because even though you have, even though like people are like, oh, but I have so much, let's say Virgo in my chart. And so they very much like connect with that energy. There's this aspect of almost we ignore the other energies, but we don't understand that we really need to learn about these energies almost even more. And this is actually what we kind of compare ourselves against. And so what's so interesting about learning about mythology is, again, you learn to connect with others on a deeper aspect too. Yeah. And you have this deeper understanding of, what's the lens of consciousness? What kind of shade of, what's their lens shade that they see life through? How do they approach this area? And so, yeah, it's just kind of this fascinating idea. So I love this furthering discussion of these symbols, and how they really are just an inner spiritual reality making itself into form. And so we have this spiritual reality, which is that forced, and it's making itself into a form so we can perceive it. Right?
And I like that you're saying form. I want to interrupt there because that's kind of what I was trying to say before. So I apologize if I couldn't come up with the right words. But ironically, that's what I'm trying to say, though, is coming up with the words is hard because I feel like the form is a lot more tangible than the words that are, written down about that energy that's coming from within to the outward. Does that make sense? And so I think the symbol helps to kind of like piece that together, that which is felt inside versus the word that's like, oh, this is what it is. And it's like, God, it's more complicated than that,
Of course. Yeah. Yeah, no, and absolutely. We, words are so limiting, right? And it's one of those aspects. It's kind of a part of that left side of our consciousness that wants to organize everything into words and wants to have a cubby for everything, but some stuff doesn't belong in a cubby, right? It's beyond the cubby. It is the cubby, and it's the space in between. And so, yeah, we have this interesting aspect of how we try to kind of organize and compartmentalize it. And again, when we kind of go back to that idea of, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, that is kind of the mindset we almost have to understand about spirituality. And it's those bigger understandings, those bigger messages. It's more we can make a network of all this information rather than kind of compartmentalizing. That's when we're really going to kind of connect to that wholeness and really kind of feel that feedback, kickback of that universal life force when we align ourselves to truth and natural law.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. No, and I'm really glad of that. we can have this conversation so openly on the podcast. Because again, I think when people listen to what we're breaking down between two friends here, they forget or maybe not know that getting to these conversations is its own spiritual gain in itself. I start the week, I start the month, I start my day with this idea in my head, and then before we know it, it's just completely sort of flipped upside down and then reassembled again. And then when I have this conversation with you, it's reassuring to know that whatever you and I have been studying together, your interpretation is not just on point with my interpretation, not because we're friends or because we both need to agree on it, but because we're actually picking up what was put down. Does that make sense? And that always gives me a lot more comfort. And I hope it does the same for the listeners, that it's a complicated subjects that we're talking about here. And we're not here to tell you what they mean and as like, as a fact, but what has been interpreted by just a person on the other end,
No, and I think the best way to kind of utilize this kind of podcast and other kind of tools of this expression, because they are conversations. This isn't a lecture like you would see like with a Manly P. Hall aspect,
Oh yeah.
This isn't set up the same kind of way. It's a conversation. But what these kind of conversations do, if you can find a community, if you have somebody who's kind of interested in these subjects, is it's like a trampoline for the conversation, because what we kind of do is we usually kind of look at the basics of it, but we cover that ground floor. And so it gives you space to kind of, if somebody else listened to this episode, you can just jump into the deep end. You don't have to go over the first 45 minutes that we talked about, because that's kind of this understanding of the base of the conversation. Right. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so, one of the really important things is trying to find a community that you can connect with people like this. And, and maybe that's something that we need to do. And, there is community on the Patreon. There's people communicate on that. But I know we've been kind of talking about making that more of a more direct connection where people can more easily connect to each other. But it's so important to be able to have these kind of conversations, to have somebody in your community, whether they're physically local to you or you have to connect to them through technology, but to have these conversations and let these ideas develop. And even if you're just having the conversation, like even if you pause the podcast and you answer a question or you just kind of share what you say, perfect opportunity, right. Have a conversation with this podcast. That's a beautiful thing to do, and I think a lot of people do it. I think a lot of people do that with all podcasts that they listen to, and that's what kind of makes unique about it. And I think honestly, when people actually do have conversations with themselves, and like I felt crazy because I was talking to myself, I'm pretty sure we somehow, some way get those messages in those breakdowns, whether it comes up in like our waking thoughts later on, but there's so many insights that come to me like a week after the podcast sometimes.
Yeah.
But it's like a perspective that I'm not even I'm like, wow, that's like a really unique lens of me. Like I usually don't see it from quite that angle. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? And there's definitely, if we understand anything about astral substance, astral vibration, how all that works, you totally pick up energy from people.
Absolutely.
And when you have a good idea, if you don't act on it, somebody else will, because it's in the universal, it's in the thought form. It's already been created. And that's why you want to kind of act on your ideas, right? We talked about how you want to guard it close to your heart and hold it, don't speak too much on it, but you want to act on those, because as soon as you hear that people all the time, they're like, oh, I had an idea for this. And then what do you know? They just started showing up, and you're like, well, what do you know? They just started showing up, huh? Right. Because it was that you have to kind of tap into those energies. And so that's a powerful kind of thing to do. But, we always talk about that, is how important it is to have some outlet to kind of talk about this information. And you also might be surprised in the people that are interested in kind of going deeper, because I think a lot of people are at least just approaching these conversations a little bit more than they would have a couple years ago. I don't know if you find the same. I think it goes either, far the other way, where they're like, get out of my house, witch, or it's like, right. You know what? I'll watch you scribble some symbols on the napkins for a couple minutes, Daniel. I'm listening to you by the punch bowl. let's see what you got today, you know? And so, but yeah, man, it's just, I think that's such an important aspect to have that kind of community that you can develop these kind of ideas and to speak your thoughts through to somebody,
Right.
you know?
Yeah, I think the importance, I mean, to make it a relatable example is I think it's always interesting how there's this groundbreaking experience that people make fun of sometimes, but we'll use this one specific example to make my point. But say if you've been to your basic college, whether it's community college or university, most individuals in their prerequisites have to take Psych 101, right? And I think it's interesting that you're introduced to Psych 101. And so now here's this sort of like base understanding of maybe emotional displacement within your life up until that point and what it could mean, right? And before you know it, you have that wise kid or girl that comes home to tell her parents like, oh, the reason you're displacing this energy onto me is because you have unresolved issues with your own mother. Before you know it, the parents kind of roll their eyes. They're like, no, I know what you're saying, but you just took one semester of this, right, and now you think you have it all figured out. And so it gets kind of put back into the drawer. And so people kind of stop the evolution of understanding more complex emotional, stunted growth, because they're like, oh, wait, you already knew about this? And then, your mom or dad are like, yeah. I mean, I
took Psych 101
I took Psych 101 too. And then before you know it, they're like, oh, I thought I just discovered everything. Mm-hmm. But unfortunately, then you move on with your life and you have other studies or other homeworks, or maybe you don't even continue with your education and you go to the workforce and start working Monday through Friday. But that's where I think you and I, when we do these breakdowns, we're furthering that information for the individual who thought, hey, I just came across something that actually had something of value to me, that had some sort of an open book to this feeling I've had between my father and I, or between my friends and I, or within myself, and how I feel and why I lean on to this feeling over the other. And here we have this beautiful community that we're creating through this podcast and through this network that allows this conversation to continue on beyond just Psych 101. Because even then, those are just a few or a handful of psychologists in the modern day who kind of had their own theories and their own conclusions, but people kind of forget that those theories and conclusions are the evolution of everything we're talking about right now that goes beyond just a 20th century psychologist or psychiatrist. They got that from these schools of mystery, these occult sciences, these forms of understanding the complexity that we are, and so I love that we continue to have this open discussion, because I don't think not only will it ever end, but I don't think it's supposed to end. I think we're supposed to continue to evolve this way in order to carry on these conversations, like you just said a little earlier, to the deep end. Complete side note, I had a Patreon member reach out to Daniel and I, and he really wanted to connect with me. And so I gave him a call and we had a conversation, and the conversation went on for 2 hours. And the most fulfilling thing about this conversation is we didn't have to start with, how did you get to listening to the podcast, or what's your life? I mean, he immediately knew, I can just have this conversation in the deep end with you. And I said, you can. And before you know it, he took me there, and I was in the deep end with him. And I was like, oh my God, I just made this new friend. And I don't think I would have had this conversation so openly with this individual had I not known that we were both looking at it from that lens. And so, does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it's when you meet people, that's why it's like it was always kind of seen as like a fraternity and an organization,
right?
Because you're at a different kind of hill, you're at a different kind of floor, you're off the checkered landscape. You're not on that floor anymore. You're a chess master. So you see other individuals that are viewing life through that lens. And so, yeah, I think it's very powerful. And again, I think we can never say it enough, just how grateful and how much of an honor it is to be on this journey with each and every one of you.
Yeah.
And it's been the most amazing thing in the world.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think using this as this conversation, one of the things that I read about from individuals who write to us is that they like the genuine conversations you and I have, which is what we're doing right now. And that we have this respect for one another. But, one of the things that I have to say, being on this side of the microphone, is that the more knowledge either of us have ever gained, it's never been about, well, now I'm going to make you feel small. If anything, every time that I feel like you acquire more and more throughout the years, a knowledge of these conversations, the one thing it led you to do is to be kinder. I feel like you've become more and more open-hearted and kinder to what I'm trying to maybe gather as an emotional thought that pertains to an experience or some kind of a path that I'm currently on, instead of you being like, oh, you don't know really how to put these pieces together, so therefore I'm just gonna let you talk and sort of roll my eyes at you. And I think that right there is a testament to everything that you study, is that you lend yourself to, well, not just with your ear, but with your emotion, to tell me, no, I know what you're saying. Like, continue. And I'm like, oh, thank you. And so I hope the same for most of the listeners, is that this isn't about who knows the most or who has the biggest library in their closet of books of the esoteric or the occult. More so, once you have the information, what's the application? And when the application is presented, it's not supposed to be this pretentious sort of complex way of regurgitating definitions that are so eloquent and so diverse. It's actually the opposite. It's like, no, now we can talk more in this sort of base level because we understand what the base is now. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah. No, well, thank you. That was amazing.
You're welcome, man. Yeah. I'm just using you as an example because you're the person that I can have these conversations with. I don't know what our listeners are out there, who they're having conversations with, whether it's their own friends or family, but that's the only person I can relate to right now, that I can say, hey, the more we know, the less we know, but the more we want to know. And the more we want to know, the curiosity should be sort of rewarded, because it's like, hey, you're not stopping there only, you're continuing on and having this unfoldment happen to you repeatedly. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, absolutely, man. And it's so funny because that was you spoke about library and who has the biggest library, but we have a fun announcement right now that who actually has the biggest library is you, the listener, because we're going to do a huge PDF book drop onto the Know Thyself website.
Yes.
Very soon. There'll be lifetimes and lifetimes of reading. And so we'll kind of do a whole breakdown episode and kind of talk about that. But everybody, please be on the lookout. That's going to get uploaded pretty soon. And so who's got the biggest library? Well, you do.
I can't wait, man. I can't wait. And again, part of the reason we're having this open conversation with all of you right now is because, again, it's going to get heavier. There is going to be more information. There's going to be, new introductions, but you're going to find Daniel and I not necessarily repeating ourselves, but having to go back and reapply one thing we've already covered multiple times in order to have a full perspective on it, or full understanding of it, or make, the most of it, and that's how I feel about even when we talked about, the Kybalion, we brought up those principles and early on in the podcast, and here they are again, and they're going to keep happening. And same thing with the 7 stages of alchemy, and same thing with, what's going to come next in season 3. So I'm excited, man.
So exciting.
But yeah, anything else you want to add to that?
No, I think we'll continue this journey next week, but no, I think until next time.
All right, man. Until next time.